On the morning of late October 2025 in central Auckland, court reporters take their seats as a rare New Zealand slavery trial resume in the High Court. Outside, it is just another weekday. Commuters on Queen Street, coffee queues, ordinary noise. Inside, Moeaia Tuai sits in the dock, facing allegations that he controlled 2 young migrants as if they were his property, keeping their passports and pay, forcing long hours of work, and committing serious sexual offences. In one article published at 5 o'clock that morning, RNZ describes a teenage complainant telling the jury he thought he was coming to school in New Zealand, but instead slept in a cold caravan and worked 50 to 60 hours a week at a boarding lodge for as little as $100 to $150. At this point, the verdict is unknown. Tuai has pleaded not guilty to dealing in slaves, rape, sexual violation, and assault. What began as an immigration hope story has become a test of modern slavery law and of how exploitation hides inside ordinary accommodation and ordinary days. In the mid-2010s, across suburban Auckland, small private boarding lodges housed a quiet population of migrants, workers, and students. These were not hotels or registered hostels, just residential properties converted into shared accommodation, often operating in regulatory grey zones where tenancy law, employment standards, and immigration pathways intersected without much oversight. Moeaia Tuai operated one such lodge, according to evidence presented in court. An Auckland resident, he would later be charged with dealing in slaves and multiple sexual offences, all of which he denies. At the time, the property functioned as many similar lodges did. Residents paid for rooms, some performed cleaning or maintenance tasks, and the person running the place handled money and logistics. What made this lodge different, prosecutors would later allege, was the degree of control Tuai exercised over 2 young people who came to stay. Their passports, according to testimony, were held by Tuai. Their wages, such as they were, passed through his hands. Their movements, their communications, their access to the outside world, all allegedly managed by one man. At this stage, nothing about the property drew official attention. No crime was yet on the books, only routines that would later be reread in a courtroom as possible patterns of control. According to testimony presented at trial, the teenage complainant arrived in Auckland believing he would attend school in New Zealand. He was young, from the Pacific, and trusting of the adult who had arranged his travel. Education was the promise. A better future was the implication. What he describes experiencing was different. Instead of classrooms, he tells the jury, there were maintenance shifts at the boarding lodge, long hours of cleaning, repairs, and physical labour. Instead of a bedroom, he slept in a cold caravan on the property. Instead of pocket money or student support, he received, by his account, $100 to $150 a week for 50 to 60 hours of work. His freedom to go out was limited, he testified. His ability to speak to others was restricted. His phone access, he claimed, was controlled. New Zealand's slavery and trafficking offences are rare charges, added to the Crimes Act to address extreme exploitation. Before Tuai's case, only one person, Viliamu Samu, had faced both slavery and human trafficking counts in a New Zealand court. These are serious allegations, requiring prosecutors to prove that a defendant exercised powers of ownership over another person. None of the teenager's allegations had yet been tested in court when he first made them. They existed only in private experience, years of silence before they reached police. The span of years when the complainants lived or worked at the property forms the evidentiary core of the prosecution's case. According to their testimony, a pattern of control emerged, one built not on locked doors or physical chains, but on documents, money, and rules. Passports were kept by Tuai, the complainants allege. Wages were handled by him. Rules governed who they could talk to, when they could leave, and what contact they could have with the outside world. Financial allegations add another layer. According to RNZ's reporting of court proceedings, one complainant claims Tuai stole approximately $78,000 from her over time. She also testified that she took out a $7,000 loan at Tuai's direction, supposedly for funeral costs, money the prosecution alleges was misused. Tuai denies theft and disputes the characterization of the loan. The defense, for its part, has introduced evidence challenging the picture of total isolation. Phone records show, according to defense counsel, that the first complainant made more than 70 outgoing calls during the period in question. If she was controlled, the defense suggests, how was she making those calls? Investigative procedure would later turn on exactly these details. Who held the passport? Who kept the pay? Who controlled the phone? Routine questions in tenancy disputes became central exhibits in a slavery trial. Those routines looked like house rules. They would become the backbone of a police file. The path from private complaint to police file is rarely direct. Exploitation allegations typically begin with a disclosure, someone telling a trusted person, a support worker, or an authority figure that something is wrong. That disclosure may lead to an official interview, a formal statement, and eventually a complaint that enters the criminal justice system. The precise timeline of how the complainants in this case first reported their concerns is not fully detailed in public reporting. What is documented is the outcome. By 2025, Moeaia Tuai had been charged with dealing in slaves, rape, sexual violation, and assault. He entered not guilty pleas to all charges. Slavery charges require Crown law and police to meet a high legal threshold. The statutory test asks whether a defendant exercised powers of ownership over another person, buying, selling, or controlling them as if they were property. This is not a charge laid lightly. Investigators must collect evidence that meets this specific definition, separating conduct that may be exploitative but not legally slavery from conduct that crosses the statutory line. Charging documents, police summaries, and media coverage of the charges form the archival foundation of the case. From the moment charges were filed, everything became time-stamped, documented, and constrained by rules of evidence. What had been private allegations were now matters of public record. Building a slavery case in New Zealand requires investigators to assemble evidence that can be tested against a precise legal standard. In the Tuai case, what they brought into court, according to reporting, included several categories of documentation. Complainants' interviews and trial testimony described passports held by the defendant, wages passing through his control, sleeping conditions in a caravan, and work hours stretching to 50 or 60 per week. These statements formed the narrative foundation. Financial records added documentary support, allegations of $78,000 stolen over time, a $7,000 loan taken out under disputed circumstances, bank statements showing money flows between accounts. Each transaction became a potential exhibit. Phone records introduced complexity. The defense obtained logs showing more than 70 outgoing calls from the first complainant's phone, evidence they would use to challenge claims of isolation. If control was total, how were those calls made? Investigators faced the task of separating what might be exploitative, low wages, poor conditions, restricted freedom, from what meets the legal definition of slavery. Not every bad employer is a slave owner. Not every controlling relationship constitutes ownership. The statutory test is specific, and the evidence must match. Disclosure obligations meant the defense received the same documents, Both sides would argue over identical records, interpreting them from opposite angles. The file now held statements, bank figures, call logs. What it did not yet have was a jury. In October 2025, the slavery trial opened in Auckland High Court. Moeaia Tuai took his place in the dock. Court reporters noted the unusual nature of the proceedings. Slavery charges remain exceptionally rare in New Zealand, and the courtroom terminology carried historical weight that few expected to encounter in a modern Auckland case. Jury selection in serious criminal trials follows established protocols. Potential jurors are questioned about their ability to consider evidence impartially, particularly when charges involve emotionally loaded terms. Slavery and human trafficking are words that carry centuries of meaning. Jurors must be prepared to apply legal definitions, not historical associations. The Crown's opening outlined the case as reported. Tuai allegedly controlled 2 young people, keeping their passports and pay, restricting their movements and communications, and committing sexual violations against one of them. The prosecution's phrase, "as if they were his property," would echo through the trial. Defense counsel signaled the challenge to come. Tuai denied all charges. He pleaded not guilty. His lawyers would dispute the complainant's accounts, question their credibility, and offer alternative interpretations of the evidence. From this point forward, every allegation and denial would be weighed not in headlines, but in evidence, testimony, documents, and the legal framework that defines what New Zealand law means by dealing in slaves. The first complainant took the stand in the early days of trial evidence. According to RNZ's reporting, she described to the jury a life shaped by restrictions she says Tuai imposed, limits on her phone use, control over her movements, pressure regarding financial matters, and allegations of sexual abuse. Her testimony painted a picture of incremental control. She told the court she was not allowed to use a phone freely. She described being directed to take out a $7,000 loan, ostensibly for funeral costs, which she claims benefited Tuai rather than its stated purpose. She alleged that Tuai pressured her to make a false rape complaint against another man, a claim the defense would later challenge. Cross-examination tested these assertions against documentary evidence. Defense counsel pointed to phone records showing more than 70 outgoing calls from her device during the period she described as one of isolation. If she was controlled, the defense asked, how did she make those calls? Who was she calling? What did those conversations contain? The defense also raised questions about financial inconsistencies and prior statements, probing for contradictions that might undermine her credibility. In modern slavery prosecutions, control is often argued through patterns rather than physical confinement. There may be no locked doors, no chains, no visible imprisonment. Instead, prosecutors point to accumulated restrictions, documents held, money controlled, communications monitored, that together constitute ownership-like power. Those same patterns, however, can be challenged with data that suggests the picture was more complicated. By the end of her evidence, the file held not just documents, but conflicting human narratives built on the same events. On the 30th of October 2025, the teenage complainant gave his evidence to the Auckland High Court jury. His account, as reported by RNZ, described an experience that diverged sharply from what he had been promised. He told the court he believed he was coming to New Zealand to attend school. Instead, he said, he found himself working long hours at the boarding lodge, 50 to 60 hours a week doing maintenance tasks. His accommodation was not a bedroom in the house, but a cold caravan on the property. His pay, he testified, amounted to as little as $100 to $150 a week. His freedom was restricted, he claimed. He was not allowed to go out freely. He was told not to speak to strangers. The world beyond the property's boundaries remained largely inaccessible to him during the period he described. Specific phrases from his testimony, as reported, conveyed the conditions in his own words. Expectations of education replaced by manual labor. Promises of opportunity reduced to a caravan and a small weekly sum. Where his account aligned with the first complainant's description, control over movement, restrictions on communication, wages handled by Tuai. Prosecutors could argue pattern. Where differences emerged, the defense might point to inconsistencies that complicated the narrative. With a second witness describing similar dynamics, what had been one person's story became, in the prosecution's framing, an alleged system of control operating under the ordinary appearance of a suburban boarding lodge. Mid-trial evidence blocks turned to documents, numbers, and the disputed meaning of financial records. Money, in exploitation cases, often tells a story. But which story depends on interpretation? The prosecution presented allegations that Tuai stole approximately $78,000 from one complainant over the period she lived and worked at the property. Bank statements, according to reporting, showed transfers and withdrawals that prosecutors argued demonstrated systematic taking of her earnings. The $7,000 loan added another layer of complexity. The first complainant testified she took out the loan at Tuai's direction, believing it was for funeral costs. The prosecution alleged the money was misused, that it benefited Tuai rather than its stated purpose. Tuai disputes this characterization, and the defense has challenged the narrative surrounding the loan's purpose and destination. Phone logs returned as a central exhibit for the defense. More than 70 outgoing calls, counsel argued, undermined the claim of total isolation. If the complainant was controlled to the degree she described, how was she maintaining outside contact? The records, the defense suggested, told a different story than the one prosecutors presented. Juries in cases involving financial evidence receive instructions on the burden of proof. Contested money flows alone do not prove slavery. They may support a narrative of exploitation, or they may be explained by alternative interpretations, voluntary arrangements, misunderstandings, or relationships more complicated than either side acknowledges. The more spreadsheets the jury saw, the more they had to decide what those numbers meant in real lives, whether they represented theft and control or something the law does not recognize as slavery. During legal argument phases, the court addressed the statutory framework that would govern the jury's deliberations. Dealing in slaves is not a colloquial accusation. It is a specific offence under New Zealand's Crimes Act, carrying precise legal requirements. The statutory definition requires proof that a defendant exercised powers of ownership over another person. This language draws on historical understandings of slavery, buying, selling, transferring, or controlling human beings as property, but applies them to contemporary contexts where ownership may be expressed through documents, money, and restrictions rather than formal legal title. Judges in such cases provide juries with legal directions on key terms. What does control mean in a legal sense? How does consent factor into the analysis? Can someone consent to conditions that amount to slavery? Or does the nature of the relationship negate meaningful choice? Where sexual and financial allegations overlap, how should jurors weigh different categories of evidence? These directions become part of the official record. They shape how jurors can legally interpret testimony about passports held, wages controlled, and freedoms restricted. The emotional resonance of the word slavery must be channeled into a specific legal test. The label is not applied by prosecutors alone. It must be matched to statutory requirements that jurors are instructed to apply. Whether the evidence in the Tuai case meets that test is the question the jury was impaneled to answer. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, both sides delivered closing addresses that offered starkly different interpretations of the same evidentiary record. Crown closing addresses in cases of this nature typically emphasize patterns of control, the accumulation of restrictions that, taken together, constitute ownership-like power over another person. Prosecutors in the Tuai case, according to reporting, returned to the phrase that had anchored their opening, that the defendant controlled the complainants as if they were his property. They pointed to testimony about passports held, wages managed, movements restricted, and communications controlled. They cited the financial allegations: $78,000 allegedly stolen, a loan allegedly misdirected. They presented the complainants' accounts as credible descriptions of exploitation that met the legal threshold for slavery. Defense closing addresses, by contrast, focused on challenging that credibility. Tuai maintained his not guilty pleas throughout. His lawyers highlighted the phone records showing more than 70 outgoing calls, arguing this evidence contradicted claims of isolation. They pointed to alleged inconsistencies in the complainants' statements, suggesting their accounts could not be relied upon to meet the high standard required for conviction. Alternative explanations were offered for the financial arrangements. The relationship between Tuai and the complainants, the defense suggested, was not one of ownership, but something more ambiguous, perhaps exploitative, in ways the law does not criminalize, perhaps mischaracterized by complainants with their own motivations. By the time the judge sent the jury out, the case existed in two sharply different narratives, built on the same documents, the same testimony, and the same legal framework. The jury retired to consider verdicts on multiple serious charges, dealing in slaves, rape, sexual violation, and assault. What happens inside that room is, by design, invisible to the public record. Jury deliberations in New Zealand are confidential. No cameras document the discussions. No transcripts preserve the arguments. 12 people sit with a stack of evidence, a set of legal directions, and the task of reaching verdicts that must be unanimous for conviction on charges this serious. What is known from media reports at the time of this narrative's construction is that deliberations were underway. The jury had heard weeks of testimony, reviewed financial documents and phone records, and received instructions on the legal definitions that would govern their decisions. What is not known is how they weighed the competing narratives, whether they found the complainants credible or doubted their accounts, whether the phone records undermined the picture of control or seemed consistent with partial restrictions, whether the financial evidence pointed to theft and exploitation or to arrangements more ambiguous than the prosecution alleged. The presumption of innocence applies throughout. Tuai denied all charges. The burden of proof rested entirely on the Crown. For conviction on slavery charges, jurors would need to be satisfied, beyond reasonable doubt, that the defendant exercised powers of ownership over another person, a high threshold that reflects the gravity of the accusation. For once in this case, there were no new documents, no fresh reports, just 12 people applying the law to a stack of files in a room the public would never see. Step back from the Auckland courtroom, and the Tuai case becomes part of a small, symbolically significant line of New Zealand prosecutions attempting to apply slavery laws to contemporary exploitation. Before Tuai, only Viliamu Samu had faced both slavery and human trafficking charges in a New Zealand court. These remain exceptionally rare prosecutions, not because exploitation does not occur, but because the legal threshold for slavery is high and the evidentiary requirements demanding. Documented concerns about migrant exploitation in New Zealand's accommodation and labour sectors have surfaced repeatedly in public inquiries, media investigations, and advocacy reports. Workers in agriculture, hospitality and construction have described conditions that, while falling short of statutory slavery, raise serious questions about wages, housing, and freedom. The Tuai case sits within this broader context, though the specific allegations against him must be assessed on their own evidence. At the time of this narrative's construction, no publicly available verdict in the Tuai trial had been reported. The legal outcome remains unknown. What is documented is this: 2 young people described experiences in court that they say felt like ownership. An older man insisted they were not. A legal system attempted to apply centuries-old language about slavery to contemporary arrangements of migration, accommodation, and work. Return to the image that accompanied RNZ's coverage: a boarding lodge exterior, a caravan in a yard, nothing visually dramatic. An ordinary Auckland address that, regardless of the verdict, now carries the weight of testimony about control, hope, money, and the question of what modern-day slavery actually looks like. On the street, it is still just another address in Auckland. In the case file, it has become a question New Zealand law is still learning how to answer.